This session is going to give an introduction to the nervous system. In the first part, we're going to give an overview of the main structural integrity of the system, and then talk about the main functions of the different parts. So we'll talk about the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, and how that's further divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. We'll then talk about how information is transferred in an individual neuron, and of course that is through action potentials, and then how the nervous system communicates from cell to cell. So how is that information transferred from one neuron to another neuron? First of all, what is the nervous system actually required to do? Well, of course, it's there to produce an effective response to the stimuli from the environment, and that environment can, of course, be external or it can be internal. If you're thinking about the external environment, you're thinking about vision, so you're thinking about light, you're thinking about temperature outside, chemicals, touch, vibration, and pain, for example. And internally, you may be thinking about chemicals, so the pH, so you're thinking about hydrogen ions, carbon dioxide. You're thinking about ions, so sodiums and potassiums. You're thinking about other molecules, such as oxygen. You're thinking about blood pressure and how that's regulated, and you're thinking about your internal temperature, and there are lots of others as well. And so when we're thinking about how the nervous system actually works, we need to talk about specific terminologies. One of those is a sensory action, and that is all about detecting a stimulus. And then you have to respond to that, and that is a motor action. Okay, and that motor does not necessarily mean skeletal muscle. It can mean smooth muscle, it can mean cardiac muscle, it can mean secretion of molecules from glands, so saliva, for example. So really what we have is a sensor or a receptor, and that picks up the information and helps to monitor what's being controlled. It passes through what's called our afferent pathway, goes to our control center, and this is where the information is sorted out. And in the body, this is usually the central nervous system, and comes out from the central nervous system through our peripheral through the peripheral pathway and the efferent pathway to our effector. And this is where we bring about an appropriate response, which, as I said, may be a muscle, so cardiac muscle or smooth muscle, or secretion of something from a gland, for example. And so what cells are actually doing all of this information? Well, it's your neuron that is the basic cell type of the nervous system. It's quite large, they're specialized cells, and they conduct impulses. They have a very high metabolic rate. In other words, they use a lot of energy, so they're very ATP hungry. And they have a specific structure to them. So they have our dendrites, which you can see on the left-hand side of the neuron picture. These are branched extensions of a nerve that receive signals from other cells. So they receive signals that are coming in, and they start to process that information, all makes its way through the cell body to the beginning of the axon at this point. And this is your cell body and the soma. And this whole cell body and the soma, this contains the organelles, so your endoplasmic reticulum, your mitochondria, and your nucleus. And it integrates the signals that are coming in from these dendrites. So remember, you can have hundreds of neurons, thousands of neurons, other neurons talking to this one specific neuron, giving information. Some of that information is stimulating, some of it is actually inhibiting these dendrites and inhibiting the function of this cell. And so the cell body basically integrates all of this signal and tells it whether it's going to be active or not. And therefore, if you reach a certain threshold, so a certain strength of signal comes in, it generates an outgoing signal to the axon. And this is where you generate what's called an action potential. So the axon is also called your nerve fiber. And this is a long process extending out from the cell body. It can be up to 1 meter in length. And it branches into the axon terminals. And these release chemical messengers to talk to another neuron, or to a skeletal muscle, for example, or to a smooth muscle, basically to the effector or another nerve cell. And like I said, it ends near the dendrites of another cell. So this can talk potentially to thousands of cells. So this one neuron can talk to thousands of cells, and it can receive information from thousands of cells. So your central nervous system is highly integrated. So if we look at our simple definitions, a neuron is a single nerve cell, and that is shown in this information. Remember what we talked about with this particular cell. You've got the dendrites that collect the information. Okay, and depending on the strength of that information, if it's strong enough and it reaches what's called threshold, you generate an action potential that goes down the axon to the axon terminal where further signals are released. So a nerve fiber is the axon bit, and a nerve is a bundle of these nerve fibers, so a bundle of the axons. We also have our sensory neurons. So they receive information and transmit impulses towards the central nervous system for processing. We have our motor neurons. These carry impulses from the central nervous system to the effector, and that is for action. So again, your muscle contractions or your release of saliva or other hormones, for example. And you have interneurons, also called association neurons. These lie in between the motor and the sensory neurons, and they basically are there to help shuttle signals throughout the central nervous system pathways. And they compose about 99% of the body's neurons, so a huge amount. Remembering, of course, when we're talking about the central nervous system, that the CNS is your brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is all other parts of the body containing nerves. So your sensory nerves in the skin and in the organs, the motor nerves, stimulating skeletal muscle or stimulating hormone release such as adrenaline, for example. So when we've been talking about these sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons, it really they're just names. So to put it into context in a simple way, we're going to just look at a simple reflex. So just presume, for example, you've been hit by a needle, as in this image. Look in the top right. There's a nice little needle and it's hit you on the skin. And that will hurt, okay? And the response to any one stimulus depends on the strength of the stimulus. For example, this simple little pinprick to the finger will lead you to raising the finger and perhaps the arm away from the pain. Whereas a stronger stimulus, for example, you walk on hot coals or whatever it might be, may activate your nerves and therefore muscles at different levels of the spinal cord, leading to entire body movements away from the stimulus. So in this particular image, you get your pinprick. This stimulates your pain receptors, your nociceptors. This is a sensory neuron, so it's coming in through the afferent pathway. Comes in through the spinal nerve and in through the posterior root. So this is at the back, okay? So this is coming in the back of your spinal cord, the posterior root. And that information is then processed in the grey matter. This is your CNS in this case, okay? So you've got your CNS there, and this is your spinal cord, little H shape or a butterfly shape. And I want you to always remember when you're thinking about grey matter and white matter, grey matter simply means the computer, so it's processing. The white matter simply means cables, so it's passing information around. So you can see that the sensory information is coming into the central nervous system in the spinal cord. And then you can see an interneuron there. We'll talk about that in a second. And you can say with the simple reflex, you talk to an interneuron and then to the motor neuron, which then goes out and causes your skeletal muscle movement. So it triggers that movement, okay, away from the pinprick, for example. So as well as that, we've got all these interneurons. We've got this little communication going on. So you can feel that pinprick. So a simple reflex, sensory neuron comes in and the motor action goes out, you lift away. Slightly after that, so this reflex is actually quicker. You haven't felt pain by this point, okay? So the information then crosses across the spinal cord to the opposite side, goes to the central nervous system and to conscious awareness. You are then aware of pain. So just to recap, of course, this is a simple reflex. You move away before you actually have conscious awareness because of this reflex, okay? Even though you would think it's not that. It is actually quicker for this simple reflex than it is to go all the way up to the brain and to have conscious awareness of it. So we're going to go through neuron classification. So we're going to just look at a few different types of neurons, their structures, and where we might find those specific types of neuron. So first thing I'd like you to do is press pause as usual, and in some way or form label the various neurons that are shown in this image. Okay, so label the cell body in each case. Label which part you think is the axon, which part is the dendrite, and which part you think is the synaptic terminal. Now, you might need to do this in your mind as this is a recording, obviously, but this is what I want you to do. So press pause and try and label these things. Okay, so the next slide, this is just showing those images. Okay, so hopefully, and those labels. So hopefully you've got this all right. Shows where your axon is, where your dendrites are, your synaptic terminals. And the cell body is nice and easy, obviously, in each case. So hopefully you got that right. Just press pause and check that you did get it right. And then we're going to talk about a couple of different types of neurons. So a bit of mixing and matching. So looking at these four, A, B, C, and D, I want you to tell me which one is the unipolar neuron. Okay, so in a unipolar neuron, the dendrites and axons are continuous, cell body is off to one side, and most sensory neurons are unipolar. And they can be very, very long. So which do you think it is, A, B, C, or D? So the answer is B, and hopefully you got that right. Which one is the multipolar neuron? So in this case, there is a single axon, again, which can be very long, and it may have two or more dendrites. It's the most common neuron type. So example, your motor neurons controlling muscles. Which one, A, B, C, or D? Hopefully you said that was number D, or letter D rather. Right, which is the anaxonic neuron? The axons are indistinguishable from the dendrites, and the processes look alike. This is found in the brain and then the special sense organs. So hopefully you know what your special senses are. So your special senses, of course, are vision, they are hearing, they are smell, they are balance, and taste. So which is the anaxonic neuron? The answer is clearly A. Last one, the bipolar neuron. Quite obvious which one it is because it's the only one that's left. But in this case, there's one branching dendrite and one axon with the cell body in between. They're quite rare and they're small. And again, these are in the special sense organs, which again, sight, smell, hearing, etc. So which one is that? That is C. Okay. So how is the nervous system actually organized? So we already know a lot of this. So you have your central nervous system, and of course your central nervous system is composed of your brain and your spinal cord. It integrates and processes the information that's coming into it. It interprets sensory inputs, so whether that's visual or auditory or olfactory or touch or pressure, whatever it might be. And it then goes on to dictate motor outputs, so skeletal muscle movements, smooth muscle movements, cardiac movements. What else? Cardiac movement, cardiac contractions, etc. So it dictates that motor output. Of course, it has blood vessels and connective tissue present to provide physical support and protection. So that's your CNS. And then your peripheral nervous system is the portion of the nervous system outside the central nervous system. And this is the part that delivers sensory information to the CNS, where it gets processed, and carries the motor commands to the peripheral tissues and systems. And if we go a little bit further, we can talk about the afferent divisions of the peripheral nervous system and the efferent divisions. And we touched on this a little bit earlier. So remember, our afferent sensory neuron are the ones that are sensory. So here we have an afferent sensory neuron. It'll pick up a signal of some description. It's coming in through our peripheral nervous system through an afferent neuron, comes into our central nervous system. So for example, our spinal cord, talks with interneurons, which go on to communicate with an efferent or motor neuron to go on to have an effect. So our effector organ, whether that's smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, etc. So the afferent division, if we're looking at it, is clearly bringing sensory information to the CNS from receptors in peripheral tissues and organs. And the efferent division is carrying motor commands from the CNS to muscles, glands, adipose tissue, etc. That's our effector tissues. So you need to understand these. Afferent coming in and into the spinal cord, remember it's posterior. The efferent division, the motor division coming out of your spinal cord, is anterior. So it's coming out of the front of your spinal cord. So what receptors do you already know? What do you think they actually detect? And they're quite simple in a lot of ways. So press to have a look at the table. Tell me what the stimulus is for each of these types of receptor. So press pause. Okay, so mechanoreceptors. They respond, as you might expect, to pressure, so mechanical force. So touch, pressure, vibration, and stretch, for example. Thermoreceptors. They respond to temperature changes, not to an absolute temperature, but to temperature changes. You can do little experiments on yourself to test this. You may already know about it. You can go out into really, really cold environments, or put your hand into some iced water so that your hand gets really, really cold. If you then just put that hand into just moderately lukewarm water, it will feel very, very, very hot. Okay, it isn't. It's the temperature itself is only mildly warm, but thermoreceptors respond to a temperature change, so therefore it feels very hot. You have photoreceptors. They respond to light energy, so that's all processed onto the retina and then out through the optic nerve. Chemoreceptors respond to chemicals. So these can be smelled or tasted in blood or in the interstitial fluid, for example. And then nociceptors, these are about pain. So searing heat, extreme cold, excessive pressure, etc. So like we've talked about the peripheral nervous system, but that peripheral nervous system could be further divided again. And it can be divided into the somatic nervous system. And the somatic nervous system controls skeletal muscle contractions. These are voluntary contractions and are under conscious control on the whole. There are a few involuntary contractions which are subconscious, for example, the knee-jerk reflex. You then have the autonomic nervous system, and this is also known as the visceral motor system, so visceral organs, if you're thinking about internal organs. So autonomic is providing automatic regulation of your smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glandular secretions, adipose tissue. You can't control this, okay? You have no control over it at all. It can be further divided into your fight or flight, that's your sympathetic division, which will increase things like heart rate, and your parasympathetic, which is rest and digest, which will decrease things like your heart rate. So to put it into context, with your somatic nervous system, which is voluntary contractions, and even though you may have some reflexes, for example, you might accidentally put your hand on a really, really hot stove, you will still withdraw that hand immediately, even before you notice any pain. But theoretically, you can keep your hand on it because it is voluntary control of skeletal muscle. I mean, you'll probably find the pain is too much to be able to do that, but theoretically you could do. There is another nervous system, of course, which is your enteric nervous system, and that just refers to the extensive network of neurons within your GI tract. And parts of it are a component of the autonomic nervous system, but sometimes regarded as a separate system, since it is capable of coordinated activity, both independent of the brain and the spinal cord. So it's like the third nervous system of the body. So here is just a little summary diagram showing you the main components. And as we'll talk about, and as we've talked about in depth, we have sensory information. So that might come in from the skin or from our visceral organs, such as the stomach. Comes often through the spinal cord, not always through the spinal cord, but mainly through the spinal cord. And then, so that's your sensory, okay? Sensory coming in via the peripheral nervous system, spinal nerves, cranial nerves, talks to the central nervous system, and then the efferent information comes out again, which goes into the somatic nervous system. So that's your skeletal muscle, which is voluntary. Your autonomic nervous system, which controls your visceral system, so it's involuntary, and which is further broken down into your parasympathetic and your sympathetic nervous systems. So what I'd like you to do, and hopefully you know this anyway, I just want you to tell me concentrations of these ions, so sodium, potassium, and chloride inside and outside the cell. And we're doing this really because this is knowing these concentrations, or at least the relative proportions, helps you to understand how action potential, so how electrical currents move along nerve cells, and therefore how we communicate in the nervous system. So I really want you to tell me what's high, what's low, okay, inside and outside the cell. If you do know the concentrations, tell me. The most important ones that you will need to know very, very quickly are extracellular potassium and sodium, and to a lesser extent, chloride. But potassium and sodium you really should know, and you will know very soon. Okay, so press pause, have a think, and then we'll go through it. Okay, so your potassium outside the cell, so in your extracellular fluid, such as your plasma, is quite low, at about 3.5 to 5 millimoles per litre. Much of a change away from that, so a rapid change down to 2.5 millimoles per litre can lead to cardiac arrhythmias, and likewise much above 6.5 rapid changes can lead to cardiac arrhythmias, and any higher than that can obviously lead to death. Sodium is high, about 140 millimoles per litre. Okay. Chloride hangs around with sodium, and that's at around about 125 to 130 millimoles per litre. So those two tend to hang around a little bit. So just its table salt, sodium chloride. Okay, so concentrations inside the cell. Potassium is obviously high, sodium low, chloride low. You don't need to know those values, okay? The concentrations inside the cell. It's really not important. Just know that their levels are opposite to outside the cell. Now then, based on these concentrations, which way does sodium want to move? If there were just leakage channels, as we'll call them, okay, so just sodium can leak one way or the other, which way would it go? And if we had leakage channels, so that potassium could move, which way would that want to move, based solely on concentration? Okay, so sodium would want to move into the cell, down its concentration gradient, down these little leakage channels, and potassium would want to move out of the cell, down its little leakage channels, out of the cell and into the extracellular fluid.